Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's event, which is a joint event with the Cambridge DAAD Hub for German Studies and the Centre for Geopolitics here in Cambridge. So my name's Chris Young, along with Chris Clark. I'm the co-director of the DAAD Hub, and I'm going to just introduce that briefly before Brendan comes and introduces our speaker this evening. I think most of you will be aware that the Cambridge DAAD Hub has been in existence now for 10 years. And if you haven't been aware, I'm delighted to make you aware at this point and drive you to our website. So the DAAD Hub here at Cambridge was set up to foster and to support research in German studies as broadly defined across the two humanities schools in the university, the School of Arts and Humanities and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And from our inception, we have sponsored projects, workshops, speakers, and encounters from everything from the archaeological prehistory of Germany to the current day. And we're at the far end of that with our event this evening. Our money comes from the German Foreign Office. It's very generous funding which comes in 5-year tranches. And we're now ending the 10th year, and we'll be entering an 11th. Clearly, next year we're running calendar years, and we're very much looking forward to that. If you haven't been on our website, or are not aware of our funding opportunities, I would encourage you to do so, because what we do with our money is give most of it away. So we give most of it away to workshops, which can last 2 or 3 days, funding of up to around £6,000, and we sponsor up to about 20 of those per year, again across the full range of subjects on that full span that I've mentioned. And we give that funding from PhD level upwards. And I can guarantee that the funding is very fairly handed out, and that PhD students stand as much chance as the most senior professors, sometimes even more chance. So it's a very flat hierarchy when we look at all of those projects. So we give a lot of our funding out back into the community to liaise and link with colleagues in Cambridge, colleagues in the UK, colleagues in Germany, and colleagues in the broader world. And looking at the statistics today, I would say that the split between our visitors, which are about 500 a year, split evenly between Cambridge and the UK on the one hand, and Germany and the rest of the world on the other. So workshops is one thing. Second thing is building up key relationships with institutions in Germany. The Institut für Zeitgeschichte we have a long-term partnership with, the Leibniz Museums, Leibniz Society Museums, and the Monk School for Public Affairs in Toronto, and there are several more as well. And finally, we run some of our own central events, and this is one of them. And we're delighted to be doing this one in conjunction with the Centre for Geopolitics, which is a very productive relationship, not least through Brendan, who sits on our management committee. So after that very brief overview of the kinds of things that we do, I would like to thank Brendan for helping to organise the event, and our speaker, Professor Henke, but Brendan will do the further introduction. So thank you, Brendan.
Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. As Chris has said, I'm Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the Centre for Geopolitics. I'm absolutely delighted to be once more engaged in partnership with the DAAD German Hub. This lecture is one of a series of lectures we've had over time with respect to the Centre for Geopolitics, focused, of course, on Germany's role in the world in the broadest framework. The remit of the Centre is the geopolitical, past, present, and future. It's pretty clear that one of the really epochal changes in European geopolitics, world geopolitics of recent time, is the fabled German Zeitenwende. The word itself has entered actually the English language as well. It's a bit like, Weltanschauung, Angst, Schadenfreude. It's one of those German words everybody knows. And we think we know the Zeitenwende, but there are many, many questions to be answered about it. What was driving it? How durable is it? How deep is it? What does it all mean? And I can't think of anybody more qualified to speak to this than Marina Henke, who I've known for some time now. She is a professor of international relations at the Hertie School in Berlin. She's also the director of the Hertie School of International Security. She's a multiply published author, particularly a book on building allied coalitions, a subject which I think is pretty relevant today when many of the ties of coalitions are fraying. That's a prize-winning work, but of course many other contributions as well, contributions to the academic journals, but also, very importantly, Marina has been engaged in outreach, broader outreach, to make better understood the chopping and changing of German policy. She's a frequent contributor to the BBC, to the ARD, to the ZDF, Deutsche Welle. She writes a lot also in the broadsheets, Washington Post, for example. So I'm pretty confident that in the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, Marina will give us some really profound insights into what has been happening in Germany and where Germany is heading. So without any more ado, Marina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brendan and the Center for Geopolitics, Chris, the DAAD. I'm truly delighted to be here. It's a pleasure, it's an honor. It's my third time in Cambridge, and I must say the city never fails to impress. It's so beautiful, the Peterhouse College where I'm staying, it's just, you know, like, it just represents what is truly absolutely amazing about British academia. So I also wanted to make a joke about Zeitenwende, but Brendan already stole this from me, because it is remarkable that every once in a while the German language provides a term where there is no exact English language translation, and you know, Schadenfreude for me is kind of like the best example, and I truly think that Zeitenwende also reflects something that isn't really captured in watershed moment or turning point in time. It means something profoundly transformational. Scholz, of course, used it in his speech that he made on February 27. He said, February 24th, so Russia's invasion of Ukraine marks a watershed, so this is the official German translation, in the history of our continent, and the world afterwards will no longer be the same as the world before. And so ever since, Germany has indeed embarked on the most consequential recalibration of its foreign and security policy since reunification. It encompasses a rethink of Germany's own identity, of its role in Europe, of its role in NATO, and ultimately also of its role in the world. What I want to do today is tell you a little bit about Zeitenwende in two parts. So the first part looks at the immediate changes that have been underway ever since 2022. And then the second part, I kind of want to put these changes in a larger perspective. And I want to ask the question, how does actually Germany's Zeitenwende fit into the larger German grand strategic trajectory ever since 1945? Okay, so let's get started with part one. If you look very closely, Zeitenwende actually encompasses four different Zeitenwende. So it's first and foremost, and the most immediate transformation relates to German relations with Russia. The second is a very significant increase in German defense spending. The third one, and related to the second one, is a transformation of the German defense industrial base, but it will actually have implication for the entire German industrial base. And the fourth one is a transformation of the social contract that has reigned in Germany ever since reunification, the contract between the German state and society, what the state has to offer society, but also what it asks from the German society. And so I would like to go over those four different Zeitenwenden bit by bit. So the most remarkable feature of German relations with Russia, roughly from the kind of early 2000s to 2022, they relate to energy. And many of you have heard about the extent of it, but I still kind of want to depict in detail what it actually entailed. So this was the primary energy consumption mix in 2021. So Germany, as you can see here, still very much relied on oil. This is especially for transport and aviation. Then it relied on gas. This is heating. So almost all of German heating of households, but also of kindergartens and of office buildings, of hospitals and so forth, rely on gas still today. There's a much smaller fraction of renewables, even smaller fraction of nuclear, and then we still also have a component of coal, lignite, and others. And here, as you see in this graph, especially when it came to gas, 55% came from Russia. You see some other statistics where it actually reached 60%. You need to think that that meant, in case of a cut of Russian gas, that almost all households and also other production, so the chemical industries also would not be able to receive any heat. And of course, Germany is also a cold, like here today, that would have been quite dramatic. And the first very sharp transformation that we saw after Russia's invasion of Ukraine was really a dramatic change in this landscape. So very, very quickly, Germany tried to reduce this dependency, and in roughly 6 months, it was able to replace Russian gas from Russia, as you can see here, with gas from Norway and then the Netherlands and Belgium. What you need to know about the gas from Netherlands and Belgium, that is LNG. And a large chunk of this actually comes from the United States. So there was a real transformation here of getting rid of the Russian gas. And by the way, Czechia is just gas that comes from Russia, got transferred through Czechia, but it was in the end also Russian gas. So here, truly impressive. When it came to attitudes of Germans toward Russia, there was a lot of talk about it. This is data from 2014. What is remarkable is the difference between East and West. So here, and the data, I checked it again, it's correct, despite it's two different questions, but the question of, does Russia constitute a threat to its neighboring countries? And should Germany defend militarily a NATO ally? So in both of these instances, you had about 40% of West Germans saying, yes, Russia is a threat, and yes, Germany should defend militarily a NATO ally, but only 28% of East Germans. But here also, we see a change, or we saw a change, a market change ever since the invasion, that now it hovers and it kind of stays at this level. Still a little discrepancy between East and West, but also that has shrunk largely. But now the poll numbers show at least 75% of Germans now do perceive Russia as a threat. That brings us to the second Zeitenwende, the Zeitenwende when it came to defense spending. This is just an overview of German defense spending over the last 50 years. As you can see, actually, high defense spending was normal. So in the first decades after Germany was able to rebuild its Bundeswehr, so starting in 1955, German defense spending actually reached 5%, even 6%. So even now, this number of 5% that was announced at the Hague Summit in NATO is not, something completely new to Germany. But then, almost all along the Cold War, defense spending hovered around 3.5%. It then drastically declined in the 1990s. And then, as you can see here, 9/11 didn't change anything. Russia's annexation of Crimea didn't change anything. It looks like there was a slight increase here at the very end, but actually this is just an arithmetic kind of phenomenon. GDP shrank in Germany during the pandemic, COVID, and so it looks that it's more, but de facto, it's not more. But in this very famous speech of February 27, German Chancellor Scholz, of course, announced the special fund of 100 billion. It sounded a lot in this particular moment. And it did lead to a first boost of German defense spending, but as you can see here, these figures would have roughly lasted until 2027. And then the special fund would have run out. So the real change and the lasting change to defense spending came this year. And this year, now under the Merz government, the constitution of Germany was changed, and so the debt brake was removed, and now defense spending is exempt of all limits. And so we have now projections that by roughly 28, 29, German defense spending will reach 3.5% of GDP, and that is roughly 158 billion. So you can see here this is really substantive money, from 60 billion roughly in 2022 to 158 billion by 28, 29. Just in comparison, France spent about 80 billion. And my understanding is that the UK right now, so this year, has a defense budget of 70 billion. So this would really catapult Germany into a completely different league. But of course, also the UK and France are increasing or slated to increase their defense spending. This is, of course, the entire NATO discussion. But it is, something truly transformational. So what kind of triggered that change? A lot of folks in Germany would point at this kind of picture. This is in February in the White House. This is the dispute between Zelensky and Trump. But I would also point in this direction. I don't think you can fully understand what's actually happening in Germany right now without looking at those headlines. Germany is in an economic crisis, and in particular the automotive industry is really hard hit. I'm from Stuttgart in Germany. It's one of the epicenters of the automotive sector. And these figures, so revenue decline of Mercedes of 56%, of Porsche 67%, but also BMW and Volkswagen are dramatic, right? I see friends and families who, feel this because they got put on part-time jobs or kind of they let it go. So there is, now reckoning of what should we do, how can we somehow save this industry? As you can see here, it's an expectation of roughly 200,000 jobs lost. By the way, the chemical industry is also affected by this, and also the steel industry. And so Zeitenwende and this massive defense spending also has an interest in rebuilding the German defense industrial base, but also, of course, the industrial base. Expectations are that you can create roughly 150,000 jobs in defense alone because of this very considerable increase in defense spending. Right now, this is the distribution from last year. 80,000 jobs in Germany are in the defense industry, about 800,000 in the automotive industry, and we will expect here a shift to, maybe 300,000 in the defense industry and the respective decrease in the automotive industry. And that will, of course, change Germany, right? You'll have many more people who will then get their livelihood paid for by working in defense. And, just defense in general will get much more normalized as a sector. So in what, very concrete areas does Germany actually want to invest? We had debates about this in the German Bundestag, and this is more a wish list than an actual procurement plan. Some of these have already been approved, but most of them are just kind of giving you a direction and what the focus is right now when it comes to how Germany wants to position itself strategically and what it wants to spend money on. So first and foremost, very heavy investments in air and missile defense. Investments in long-range strike capability and deep precision attack, but then also in ground forces. There are plans of purchasing 787 Puma infantry fighting vehicles, and here I think it starts to make sense how this transition out of the automotive sector into the defense sector is plausible, right? Because this is Rheinmetall, and in the end, this is a vehicle. Right? It has a pretty heavy gun, but it is still a fighting vehicle. There's also a plan to purchase 424 Boxer or Chancellor infantry reconnaissance vehicles, and also a lot of ammunition for artillery. Next, it's a strengthening in air power. So here it's 15 more F-35s from the United States. 35s have already been purchased in 2022. Missiles, more Eurofighters, maritime patrol aircraft, helicopters. A fifth center of investment is space, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, secure communications, and then, of course, drones, and drones. Counter-drones and electronic warfare. All of this encompasses roughly 377 billion. So I'm interested in the capabilities, but I'm mostly interested in the grand strategic repercussions of it, right? And that's why I'm interested in who actually gets that money. And again, this is all preliminary and we can't really say. But the bulk of money will go to Germany. Right? Roughly, when you look at those systems where they are produced, 160 billion will go to Germany. This is the vehicles that I talked about. It's air defense systems from Deal Defense. It's also satellites. Actually, there are plans to put, similar to Starlink's, a kind of like a low orbit satellite systems into place. It's the Eurofighter assembly. It's the ammunition. But then you also see the United States receiving a lot of that money. The F-35s, all sorts of missile systems, the Tomahawks, naval-based systems, the ARAMs, patrol aircraft. So clearly also the United States will benefit from this. And then you have EU partners here. It's much vaguer. We don't really know what's actually happening. But I would estimate, just again, looking at the systems, it is in this realm of 80 billion. It's the Eurofighter shares, it's the Boxer vehicles, it's Airbus helicopters, it's the space systems, and then you see a portion also going to Israel. So after all of this, and this is data from the Boston Consulting Group, German defense will look, when it comes to domestically produced, regionally produced, and internationally produced, like this column here. And just in comparison, in Russia, 100% of defense equipment gets produced in Russia. China is very close, by 98%. The United States is by 78%. The UK actually, has quite a big component that is not regionally or domestically manufactured. And Germany will then be at kind of like the 61% level, still with a chunk, again, mostly US and Israel produced, but it will have a pretty significant increase in all of this. So that leads me to the fourth Zeitenwende. And this is kind of the transformation of the social contract between the German state and society. Because even if you have all this capability, you also need troops, you need soldiers. And this was actually a very intense and to a certain degree also controversial debate. It was kind of solved just last week, because the German Bundeswehr says we need to get from currently 180,000 troops to at least 240 active duty by 2035. And so the aim is to recruit 20,000 now every year. And so the big question was, does Germany need to reintroduce conscription? And the compromise that was found now that there will be a voluntary service, but every single male individual at the age of 18 will need to undergo a mandatory physical exam. And the hope is, and also fill out a questionnaire, and the hope is that out of this cohort, so this cohort is roughly 300,000 strong, 20,000 will volunteer. And it's very interesting to think through what is the incentive for these folks to go to the military, and in the end, the German government has actually decided it is monetary, because every single one of these volunteers will receive 2,000 or up to 2,600 euros per month. And for an 18-year-old or even 20-year-old, that is good money. So the median salary in Germany is 2,400 euros per month. So that is net, so after tax. It's a little unclear how the tax situation goes when it comes to these 2,600, but clearly, it is also a pretty significant increase from what they receive right now. But still, you see some skepticism, right? So overall, the question is, should conscription, so real conscription, be reintroduced? Because so far, this new system is voluntary, but if the numbers are not met, so if the Bundeswehr cannot recruit on a voluntary basis the 20,000, there might be a reassessment, and then actually some kind of lottery system or some mandatory conscription might be introduced, but we are not there yet. First, they want to give it a go with the voluntary system. But as you can see here, overall, there is a majority of Germans that says, yes, it should. But actually, like 45% say it should be for men and women. Women right now are not allowed to participate in it because it is set in the Constitution. And the government right now doesn't have the majority in the Constitution to change it. And also conservative elements in the government don't want it. But 45% of the German population would say it should be for men and women. But the interesting number is actually here the no. Because in the no group, you see the young people, right? And you see 46% of the age group 18 to 34 who actually are skeptical, right, and don't want it. And of course, it is exactly those who will actually participate in the conscription. Also interesting are numbers such as these. When the question is posed to the Germans, would you be willing to fight for Germany with weapons? And here, like the 61 for men, that is actually pretty standard. So the numbers are not higher in Scandinavian countries or, for example, the United States. That is a fairly decent number. What is very low is the women again, 21. And here you can see that, like a lot of communication and integration and also kind of outreach needs to happen in this group, because under the current circumstances, this would not fly. When you think about the social contract between state and society, it's not just about serving in the military or fighting for your country, but of course it also relates to the welfare state. And right now, as many of you know, Germany finances all of this by taking on debt. Right? It's all based on credit. And that can go on for a while. So Germany, the GDP to debt ratio in Germany was until now 60%. Germany will now go up to 80%. But it did have this possibility, this flexibility, right? A lot of countries don't have it. For example, the UK. So Germany could take on this debt. But of course, this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance. At one point, it will also reach the ceiling. And then it needs to get financed in a different way. And here it seems that, especially, again, among the young people, there is some willingness to take in cuts in the social sector, because that's where this would happen. This is where most of the spending is in Germany. Right? But of course, this is a hypothetical question, so we don't really know. But this is the critical question for the future, right? Can the social welfare state in Germany be maintained while at the same time keeping defense level at 3.5%? So this leads me to the second part of my talk. And this is, of course, the larger question of how does all of this actually fit into Germany's grand strategic trajectory? And let me kind of define what I mean by grand strategy, because I know it's a term that has a lot of definitions, and now it really gets to the core of my own research. So for me, a grand strategy is a coherent strategic concept that gets repeated in documents and speeches. It does never, need to be called a grand strategy because it doesn't exist in Germany. But it does need to contain three elements. The first one is a grand strategic goal, an overarching goal that defines what a state wants to achieve over the medium to long term. The second element is a set of strategic challenges. And the third element is a fairly coherent logic of action that explains how the state wants to overcome those strategic challenges to reach the goal. And postures or ideas of grand strategies have, been many in Germany, but only 3 have been implemented so far. And the first one, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is Westbindung. This was a grand strategic concept implemented by Adenauer since the very beginning of his chancellery. Here, the grand strategic goal for Konrad Adenauer was security and stability for West Germany. This is what he was focused on, West Germany. Reunification was a secondary goal. The core strategic challenges he identified was the Soviet threat, but also then German normalization, so for Germany to re-enter the League of Respected Nations, and of course also economic reconstruction after the war, right? So we're here now in 1949 until the early 60s. And his logic of action that he passionately believed in was a very close relationship with the United States, but also European integration. Right? He, de facto gave up the Ruhrgebiet to enter into European cooperation, the European coal and steel community. Right? An exchange was made where Germany said what is most precious about its natural resources would be shared with other European nations. But in the name of European integration, in the name of Westbindung, in the name, of course, also of normalization. Behind this stood the idea of peace through strength. If West Germany integrated this club of the most powerful nations, in Adenauer's opinion, the Soviet Union inside would weaken, it would be intimidated, and eventually it would come to the table to negotiate. And through this negotiation, reunification and peace again could be achieved. This grand strategy lasted and worked well until the Second Berlin Crisis. And then you had certain doubts emerging. The doubts emerged because the United States then started détente with the Soviet Union. In West Germany, they had a lot of fears that the United States would, over the heads of Germany, West Germany, negotiate some kind of settlement. And it also, to a certain degree, weakened as a concept because Charles de Gaulle was no longer fully interested in European integration per se. So he wanted la gloire for France, but not so much a full integration also for West Germany. And so you have then baby steps taken already by his successor, Erhard and Kiesinger, but Ostpolitik comes as a fully blown grand strategy to the floor under Willy Brandt. And here again, it is actually a different grand strategic goal, at least with a different nuance. It is still security and stability for West Germany, but also reunification. Right? For Brandt, reunification was much more of a central topic than for Adenauer. The strategic challenges for him and his team identified was not just the Soviet Union and German normalization by this time, and also reconstruction had been achieved to a large degree, but it was now also the United States that was wobbly, and France, as I mentioned before, Charles de Gaulle, who also could not be fully counted on. And so the logic of action then changed to one as West Germany as a bridge between East and West, but also as this bridge builder using the leverage. If the West didn't fully comply with German wishes, one would go to the East and negotiate with them and use this as a leverage, and vice versa. And in the larger concept, especially when it came to reunification, it was no longer change through strength or peace through strength, but change through rapprochement, with really close ties between East Germany and West Germany, so that like the nationhood and the culture could be revived, and that the East Germans felt also that they belonged to West Germany, they were a nation, and so like that this idea of reunification wouldn't die. Ostpolitik was basically practiced in some form or fashion also by Chancellor Schmidt and also by Helmut Kohl in his first period as Chancellor until reunification. It had bits and pieces also of Westbindung in there. I think like Chancellor Schmidt in particular found the perfect equilibrium between Westbindung and Ostpolitik. And so we have to go to Kohl after reunification, or the moment of reunification, where we see another pure or almost pure form of Westbindung. And it's actually a fascinating time, because for Kohl, the grand strategic goal became security and stability now for a reunified Germany. The strategic challenge, of course, first and foremost, reunification, but also an unstable, somewhat potentially resurgent Soviet Union still, or Russia. And again, for Kohl, very much, it was Westbindung, meaning that East Germany gets absorbed by the West and immediately becomes a member of NATO, but also European integration and, of course, monetary integration, the euro, that would stabilize first reunification and ultimately also Europe. So he very much kind of like adopted Adenauer's stance and was firmly committed to this grand strategy. And this lasts first under Schröder when he gets elected, and really the moment when it changes is Iraq. Iraq, 2002, 2003. And I call the grand strategy that Germany implements in this particular moment global Germany, because actually it's not too unrelated to global Britain, and I think you'll understand this in a second. Of course, also with certain nuances, and the German version of it. So, Chancellor Schröder, he changes the grand strategic objective. It's no longer security and stability. He takes this for granted, and it is now economic prosperity. Germany falls at the end of the 90s, in the early 2000s, in an economic recession. And the big question then becomes, how can the high unemployment come down? And how can Germany deal with the stagnant and declined domestic European demand? But also, on the other hand, there's globalization, right? You see these booming markets in Asia, but also in Latin America and other parts of the world. And so the logic of action that the team under Schröder then develops is one, and this is why it's not unlike Great Britain, where Germany no longer just focuses on the traditional markets and allies it has. The difference, however, to Great Britain is that it never kind of leaves or wants to leave or cut its ties to Europe. No, it is Europe and the United States, but then in addition, it wants to deepen and find greater growth and prosperity in these new rising powers. And the new rising powers, defined in 2002, is Russia, China, Brazil, and India. But of course, the trigger for all of this is also that Germany estimates the United States is in decline, Europe is in decline, and we need to shape globalization, we need the support of these new rising powers. And so Germany starts calling itself a Gestaltungsmacht, or shaping power, but also wants that these other powers become shaping powers. The big question is then, like, to shape what? In the end, it is to shape globalization, to shape this new order that is emerging, where you have these BRICS nations claiming attention, of course, also having increasing power. When you look very closely, the Gestaltung, the shaping, yes, also includes democracy, human rights, but a very heavy focus is on the setup of a global free trade and investment architecture. Right? Basically, rules and regulations that would make trade flows and also investments safe and secure. And this is then, when Germany kind of starts this boom as an export nation. Right? As you can see here, yes, it grew already starting in the mid-1990s, but the really stark increase happens in the early 2000s, where it really goes through the roof when it comes to its dependence on exports. And so now, until this day, Germany is more dependent on exports and goods and services than the United Kingdom, much more than China, and much, much, much more than the United States. And just to illustrate, this growth did not come from Europe. It did not come from the European Union. The share of trade that Germany had with other EU partners hovered around 50%, so it was important. Right? So it is still very important. 50% of your trade is very, very important, but it didn't grow. Right? There was no extra prosperity to be gained. Right? It was the maintenance. The growth came from here. And here, of course, in Germany, there's a lot of talk always about China, but the United States was equally as important. Right? So like a lot of the experts that doubled, tripled, at times quadrupled, were actually also going to the United States. So Chancellor Merkel basically continues this trend. So for her also, the grand strategic goal is economic prosperity. The challenge is how to maintain this export growth model. And of course, she refines this logic of action. And I'm sure you heard about this now a lot. It has these pillars, so cheap energy from Russia. It lowers the labor costs, or the production costs, not the labor costs. Market access and technology from China, but also, and she put a heavy emphasis on this, good relations with the United States. And of course, it was fairly easy with Obama, but she also, like really engaged with Trump in his first administration, and was absolutely critical. So what changed for Germany is that the European Union no longer constituted a destination as it constituted under Westbindung, destination as ever further integration and maybe eventually a federation. It became a tool, right? But a very useful tool, a value tool. So never any questions were raised. But a tool to further also this export growth strategy. Euro came very handy, right? It kind of de facto lowered the German currency. And of course, Germany used the EU again as a regulatory power. Europe, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this term because Europe had a voice in regulating trade and investment, right? It was an absolutely critical actor. And also what Merkel fundamentally believed, that you can create peace through economic interdependence. So she's actually now, talking about that she thought the Minsk process, so this is the process that tried to create peace in Ukraine, would only continue if Germany would implement Nord Stream 2, right? And the logic here is basically Putin only has a reason to stay in the Minsk process and wouldn't escalate Ukraine if economic dependence would continue. And she saw Germany as having a critical role in that. Right? Of course, all of this collapsed. Scholz started a grand strategic rethink, but couldn't terminate. His government fell apart, and so now we have Friedrich Merz. And I would say that the bits and pieces that we are seeing right now are actually pointing into the direction, again, of Westbindung. He has, again, a redefinition of the grand strategic goals that Germany focuses on, right? Security and stability is back, right? No question about that. The strategic challenges, of course, are immense. It is a de facto collapse of this rules-based trading order that Germany tried to establish during 20 years. Right? Protectionism is all around us, and the WTO is de facto dead. So the rules-based order, when it came to trade and investment, de facto no longer exists. We have a revisionist China, we have a MAGA United States, and also a pretty fragile European Union. And also here, because Germany actually was not fully invested in the EU per se as an institution. And what is, however, the logic of action that we see here? We see, first and foremost, an intent to keep America close. It was an immediate instinct also from Scholz. One of the very first announcements after Russia's invasion was we're going to buy the F-35. And this is the nuclear sharing mission in Germany. And even now with Trump, so there was a debate in the German government, should we still invest in American systems? And I showed you before. This is the Patriot system. This is the Typhoon. This is, again, more F-35s. Right? And the discussion came down to, yes, we're going to risk it. We're going to do it. We need America. There is also an intent, and that's probably, that's also in the making. But you've probably all heard of the Draghi report. There is an intent to now implement some of the measures to deepen the EU internal market and hope for some greater kind of growth prospects coming out of Europe. Of course, every grand strategy is a bet on the future. The bet is, can the economic prosperity that was gained from these other markets, can it be now replaced by the European Union? there is a whole bunch of European security coalitions of the willing. And this is just in the last 2 to 3 years, the bilateral agreements that Germany has concluded. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the UK agreement. It's certainly the most comprehensive. It has a defense clause in it, but still, there are agreements with Italy and Latvia, Lithuania, and so forth. But what is quite interesting when it comes to the current kind of implementation of Westbindung compared to Kohl in the 1990s and Adenauer in the 1950s is that the constraints on Germany are much less. Right? So Germany in the 1950s was an extremely weak state. And it basically had to comply no matter what. It was, until 55, it wasn't even a sovereign state. And so when you look at the big picture of German rearmament and NATO and, European integration, all of this, was the maneuver of the German government was fairly limited, right? It knew to a certain degree it had to comply or, it would immediately fall out of favor. It was not easy. In the 1990s, it was to a certain degree similar because Germany wanted reunification so badly. And so it wanted to also gain the favors of the United States and of other, like the France and the UK and so forth. Right? And right now, these constraints are much looser. Right? Trump is all over the place. And the European Union does not have, especially France, does not have the same influence and pressure on Germany. Right? And so there is this kind of risk that Germany, if this grand strategy doesn't work out, that it will revert to something that is much more Germany-centric in the logic of, Germany first. So with that, I want to conclude. As you can see, Zeitenwende is real. It's happening. It is transforming Germany on multiple levels. The fastest change certainly is the relation with Russia. A little slower has been defense spending. For better or worse, a lot of more German people will work in the defense industry going forward. Still slower is the changes to Germany's societal contract, the recruitment of soldiers, but very soon you will have the Bundeswehr present in German high schools and most living rooms. This transformation, of course, also represents an opportunity. I can integrate East Germany and West Germany, potentially. Also immigrant communities that also, if they have a German passport, need to serve. And lastly, there's this big grand strategic transformation that Germany is currently going under. I think it has largely abandoned the grand strategic framework that it adopted during 2002 until 2022. We see presently a return to the Westbindungs logic, but as I said before, it is somewhat on fragile grounds. And so I hope I will get invited again to Cambridge in a couple of years to report back what's happening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was very compelling, both the way in which you, at the beginning, drill down really in a very granular way into what's actually happening in Germany, and as you say, it is pretty substantial, much more substantial, I think, than many of us realize. And then in the second part of your lecture, putting all that in the wider context of the evolution of German strategic thinking, the move from Westbindung through the various different iterations of Ostpolitik and Wandel durch Handel back to Westbindung. So we're back, in a sense, to where we started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience for their views and what they want to ask. And I'd like to begin with the question of Europe, actually, which you mentioned on a number of occasions that Germany's strategic thought had developed in sync, really, with European integration. And I wonder to what extent we are now seeing a shift. I mean, how much, because the Germans, to a certain extent, as you know, have really hidden, in a way, within and behind Germany, to a certain extent, fearful partly of themselves, but also partly what other people think of them. To what extent do you think now that Germany has sort of moved out from that shadow, that it's being a little bit more, it would have liked the European structures to have reacted more strongly, but now it feels it has to act itself, or is it still in that traditional, slightly crouching position?
So I actually would say that starting when Schröder came to power, Germany very slowly but steadily undertook the shift, which I also alluded to in the lecture, from Europe as a destination to Europe as a tool. And it's actually quite fundamental, because Europe as a destination really meant that Germany was believing in a European future, right? Really in European statehood, if you want, in a European federation, in a European nationality, in a European army, all of these kind of things. And I would say that, Kohl believed in it. He wanted it. Schröder, no more. Merkel, no more. And Merz is of this generation, right? He's older, he served in the European Parliament, who also has bits and pieces in him. But of course, the European Union of today is very different to the European Union of the 1990s. Right? So in the 1990s, there was still a lot of hope and aspiration. And, ever since, you see fragility in bits and pieces. And I would say, one of the reasons why the European Union has grown so fragile is also because there was no longer a German leadership in it, right? So this integration, for example, regarding Brexit, I fundamentally believe if Germany had stood there, starting in the 2000s, really working with Great Britain from the get-go, what is it what you want? What is it what you need? What can we give it to you? Then there would have been maybe no Brexit. But Germany wasn't there because Germany was focused on other markets. Germany was dealing with China. Germany was dealing with Russia. Germany was more interested in BRICS. Right? And so I think right now there is an instinct to work with Europe, but Merz already, in just the last 6 months, has realized that, for example, who's in charge of France? Right? And as you saw here in the bilateral agreements, and even when it comes to the purchases, France is almost nowhere to be seen. Right? So a lot of these projects, defense industrial projects, could involve France, but they don't. Right? FCAS is stalled. There are considerations even that Germany might join the Tempest project. And so I think for the time being, there's a real interest, but in both. So it goes both ways, right? Merz really tries to still have the Americans on board and cooperate with the European nations. But if he gets rebuffed on both fronts, or just realizes it's not working, then there might be actually a turn, more inward from both of these fronts.
Thank you. Now, you spoke quite a bit about the importance of the defense industrial transformation. And it's easy to see how the Zeitenwende is almost a lifeline, as you were suggesting, to certain German companies. But isn't there also a risk here that a lot of these companies, you meant BMW, VW, Volkswagen, and then on the defense side, Rheinmetall, they are to a certain extent legacy producers, so they're kind of metal bashers. So these might have been systems which are extremely useful, let's say in 2022, but nowadays, as you know, we've moved to much more of drone warfare. And isn't there a risk that a lot of the money goes into those systems and not into, say, Helsing and the more innovative side of the sector? I know you've thought a bit about this, but perhaps you could share with the audience some of your thoughts.
So as you saw in the lecture, Germany right now has two competing grand strategic goals. But to a certain degree, to find the perfect equilibrium is almost impossible. Right? And so the jury is still out which one will be more important, meaning economic prosperity, the revival of German industry, or security and stability. And we see bits and pieces that would actually say economic prosperity is again more important, as it was ever since the 2000s. And that would mean exactly, you're investing in a lot of fighting vehicles, because this is where the transition is easy, and this is what a lot of Mercedes engineers can easily do. And you don't go into the drone technology, you don't go into sensors and so forth. Right? I still have a little hope that there might be some waste, but not total waste. Because of course there is also an aspiration to create entire new branches of industry, and that's the focus on space. We have now a space ministry. And so, I hope, I'm still hopeful. Yeah.
So I've got many more questions, but I know the audience will also have theirs. So I'm going to just ask one more for now. And that is to do with really how deep the Zeitenwende is. I mean, you've made a very strong case for it being, very profound in terms of expenditure. But do you think it's irreversible? Because there is a school of thought that says that many parties in Germany, I'm thinking particularly the left wing of the SPD, some elements of the CDU, certainly Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, Die Linke, and of course the AfD, are very skeptical about this whole process and are just waiting for the moment at which they can resume normal service, so to speak, to go back to Ostpolitik, to go back to Wandel durch Handel. Do you think that that's a realistic possibility, or do you think that, to use the cliche, that this supertanker has turned, is turning, and will not turn back?
So the AfD is really interesting because they just last week had an internal battle. It was Kropala, one leader said, me and my team, we're going to a conference in Sochi, Russia. That's exactly what you're referring to. Right? That is a segment of the AfD who says, and also the minister of Saxony is like, the moment we have some kind of agreement in Ukraine, we're taking back the gas from Russia. But the leader of the AfD, interestingly, Alice Weidel, said, absolutely not. And she's more powerful. And she said, I forbid you to go to Sochi, to Russia. And that is kind of right now the party line. And it's also interesting because basically she realizes if the AfD really wants to gain power in Berlin and not just on the federal level, she needs to get the votes in the West. And in the West, I would say there's at least the notion of, again, rebuilding relations with Russia is dead. And she has a very good sense for that. And so she is turning toward MAGA, the United States. Right? The future for Alice Weidel and the AfD, the model is MAGA in the US and not Putin's Russia. And what you need to know, we have 12 million inhabitants in East Germany and 65 roughly in West Germany. So very often people think it's half-half. It's not half-half. Right? And so even if the AfD is very, very dominant, what it is right now in East Germany, you cannot get real power without West Germany. And I think she has understood that in West Germany, the Russian connection is dead.
Thank you. You keep the microphone. So I'm now going to take audience questions. I already have one, too, in fact. But if you could please give your name and your affiliation, if you have one, it would be helpful, and keep your question as brief as possible.
Hi, Jack Ellis, Center for Geopolitics. I have a question about demographics and monetary politics. This whole idea of Zeitenwende, rebuilding the defense industrial base, is a good idea if you can execute it, but the two biggest headwinds, as far as I can tell, are a demographic trend that's only going to increase pressure on pensions, which is currently the largest expenditure set in the German budget, and that's only going to get worse as the population ages. And trying to fit in more defense spending into that is going to be a struggle. It's going to create some really difficult politics. And if you were an American, you could just spend your way out of it. But obviously the European Central Bank and the other sort of myriad restrictions to do with this sort of common currency restricts Germany's ability to do that. So I just wonder how much of this policy is actually thought through these really long-term structural constraints that will happen on Zeitenwende. I mean, we're seeing the reform politics for pensions play out now. But it's only going to get worse. The demographic story is really bad for Germany. And the macroeconomic story doesn't look much better. So that's maybe a provocation, but that's my question.
You probably follow the discussions, right? That's exactly the hot topic. And everybody just wants to push it away, because right now the credit is on the table. Right now the money is there, right? And of course you can always ask these big questions of what happens, in 10 years when really, shit hits the fan, if you want. But but the geopolitical situation also might be somewhat different in 10 years, right? There might be war in the Pacific, for example. Right? So I understand when some people say, if this works out in deterring Russia for the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, goal achieved, right? And we tackle these other issues later, because this is not necessarily a grand strategic posture for the next 50 years. Right? And so I think there's right now this kind of more short-term thinking, because, when you talk about demographics, but this is in the entire Western world, the social system with pensions will collapse, period. Right? So this is not just related to Zeitenwende. In every single country that has a system based where the young population pays into a pot for the old population, it will collapse. Right? So in every single one of these countries, this question needs to be tackled. And you can argue that Zeitenwende kind of reinforces this, makes it even worse. Right now, as I said, German debt to GDP ratio is still a little bit better, and even after that, it will be still a little bit better. So there's a little space for maneuver. France, for example, cannot do it. Italy cannot do it. Sweden could do it. They can also have good. But there is right now just not to deal with these massive questions right now. That's the truth.
Victoria.
Thank you so much. Victoria Vdovichenko, Center for Geopolitics, and thank you so much to explaining the grand strategy in such simple words, because it's really hard, so compliments to you. And I can say Germany is one of those few examples in the world which basically implementing the grand strategy really works. UK is still elaborating that. My home country, Ukraine, is still elaborating the grand strategy, so you did it. Actually, two things, if I may, they are very much interrelated that I would like to ask. There was no word of NATO being mentioned on your website, on your slides, and I really wanted that you can echo to what extent Germany's grand strategy as of now echoes to what we say European allies of NATO. And in this respect, how do you see, as of the end of 2025, the coalitions of willing, where 5 of which Germany is leading, how they're going to be implemented, or what you see embedded into the Germany's grand strategy? Thank you so much.
So NATO is front and center, right? When I talk about Westbindung for me is NATO, right? This is kind of one and the same term. And the German defense spending, bilateral agreements, this is not European strategic autonomy. It's just not there, right? Again, I said, what I didn't talk much is France, because the reality is that it doesn't feature very prominently. If you really wanted to build up European strategic autonomy, it would, you would not have 30, 40 billions invested in the United States. Right? So there is very much a focus on NATO, and Germany wants to get ready to implement those NATO plans. Right? Of course, one can ask a question: what happens if the United States is only 80% invested, 50%, 20%? Can Germany make up for this? Can Great Britain make up for this? Can the rest of Europe make up for this? Right? This is the big question where it's not really thought through. Right? I had a chance to talk to a very high-level British NATO official the other day, Angus Lapsley, and I said, total confidence. Is there some kind of discussion about command and control if the United States removes SACEUR? He was like, no, it doesn't exist. Right? I think this is where the big gap is, because Eisenhower once said, plans are useless, but planning is everything. So I think there should at least be some kind of planning for this kind of scenario.
Lady at the back.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Eva Hartmann, Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge. I have a question, given that we are at the university here, and I would like to hear your thoughts. Because of the historical legacy of the demilitarization, in Germany, what we can see, there's a clear separation between research for civil purpose, or civil research and military purpose. And many universities have signed a civil clause where they kind of commit to civil research. So my question is, the Zeitenwende that you described and the social contract that you described, does that also include research and that clear understanding between, or separation between military research and civil research?
So, yes. My frank answer to you is yes, although, you know, like I don't know whether some kind of very clear regulations need to be completely abolished. But this is where the money is right now, right? I mean, if you're at TUM or if you are at, you know, University of Nuremberg, Erlangen, the money, and, you know, you can always speak of dual use. A lot of this is dual use, but the big money infusions are in these new areas. And in the big picture of things, Germany is still a small country. Right? So it cannot, it's impossible to do such a transformational program without including especially the STEM areas of German universities. Right? It doesn't exist. Space, for example, is huge in Bavaria. And so I know that Bavarian universities are very much involved. So when it comes to the social sciences, also there's a push of, you know, engaging much more, whether this is, you know, strategic thinking, history, topics of grand strategy, and so forth. And also there, you know, I mean, of course, you still have pockets of pacifism, but I think there is a realization of Bucha, of the behavior of what the Russians are doing. You know, I mean, when you're in Berlin, all of this feels, I think, still much closer than Cambridge. We still have thousands of Ukrainian refugees. There is a real rethink that we need to do, you know, like what we can. And it also involves the social sciences.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Nick Danby, Cambridge Polls. Just going off of Professor Sims' question, but transplanting to a foreign audience. I think onlookers and allies, particularly the US, are optimistic and warmly welcome the German defense build-up renaissance sprint, if you want to call it, but there's still some healthy skepticism that Germany will not live up to the ambitious plans, some of which you outlined, that may fall short. Curious to know if you think that there are either benchmarks or metrics or some sort of measurable kind of guideposts that we could use to determine the fiscal and political sustainability of this Zeitenwende or build up, you know, both today, but also maybe 5-10 years out when some of those programs and ambitions you listed come to fruition.
I mean, the clearest first benchmark is, will the recruitment of, you know, the Bundeswehr targets, will they be met? Because this is next year. Will they actually have 20,000 new recruits? And I think it will be an interesting benchmark on all sorts of levels, right? Also, from a societal level, do you find these young people who want to serve, right? Or do they need to be forced? And also, of course, you know, just with the setup of the infrastructure, you know, is this actually happening? I think, you know, next year, roughly around this time, we can actually have this benchmark because they should be recruited by then, 20,000. And then, of course, as you will see, you know, I mean, the downturn of the German automotive sector, chemical sector, steel sectors, they're real. You see these people losing their jobs every single day. And so why do I think at least a part of it is very real? Because, as you know, Germany is very much interested in having a good economy. It's an entire identity. And so I think it will do a lot. It will go to great length to find new jobs for these people. Unemployment is the worst thing that can happen to Germany. And so I think, you know, there will be a transformation of the defense industrial base. Of course, the big risk is exactly what you said, that there will be then 700 fighting vehicles, but, you know, very little drones, very little ISR systems and so forth. I think this is the real danger. I think there will be a production of military capabilities, maybe the wrong ones.
Who would like to ask the last question? If I have one, so if I don't see, yes.
Thank you. I thought the discussion about young people not being keen on this idea of conscription or having assessments at 18 on, you know, what's your physical, are you fit to be part of the military? And the fact that they were least keen on raising taxes, but happy to look at other cuts. What might young people be willing to cut in order to increase defence expenditure? Because
pensions.
It's an issue, I think, in this country as well.
Well, Brendan had the answers, pensions. Right. So this is exactly, so you have the young group in the German parliament that is kind of right now leading the revolt against the Merz and also Klingbeil, the SPD proposal, right? And so This goes back to demographics. They think that their contribution to the pension fund is just outrageous, and it is. It is, right? But again, this is like a larger question that it doesn't just pertain to Germany. I think, it regards all of us. And what I find interested in, I mentioned it in the lecture, there was also a discussion on how should you recruit those young people? Should you do it with nationalism, or not nationalism and, go fight for Germany, but some kind of national spirit and, why you do it? Should you do it with some kind of European ethos? But in the end, they went for money, right? And this also is based on polling. Basically, the only factor right now, at least to get this kick-started, is to offer a really high salary. And again, for young people, 2,600 euros per month is pretty good.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I was going to, if I had asked the last question, I would have asked about the depth of that youth sentiment, because I'm always reminded when I see those figures, which are obviously true, of the famous debate in the Oxford Union, where the students said they would not fight for king country, but of course they did. And it's not at all clear how German youth would react in the event of an emergency. And we simply don't know, and that's not knowable until it happens. But I think everybody here will agree that this has been a really memorable Centre for Geopolitics, German hub collaboration. We've learned a huge amount. We come away knowing now that the Zeitenwende exists, is happening, will continue to happen, and is a reality that everybody has to deal with. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I need to finish, not before doing three things. First of all, to invite you to stay tuned to the German Hub and the DAAD, to stay tuned to the Centre for Geopolitics. Our next event is actually in this room on Bosnia, a really exciting documentary film on the siege of Gorazde in the 1990s. So that's on Thursday at 5 o'clock in this room. Secondly, to invite you all to a reception. I believe that's in the Bateman room next door. And thirdly, of course, to thank Marina Henke very much indeed for her lecture and for handling the questions so well. I'm most grateful to you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Good job. Well done.